Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothgeschow.
Coming at you with a little bit of post-holiday, I guess you could call it brain candy today. First of all, I hope everybody had a great Christmas, has had a great holiday season in general, no matter what you celebrate. And I know I can say I had a very good holiday. I'm ready to get back into swing of things here with probably going to go a little bit over an hour here, maybe around 75 minutes or so. And I hope that what we get into will help maybe satiate some people's post appetites for our kind of conversation after hopefully having a few good good days to spend, maybe not being so focused onto a lot of this stuff.
And that's why I would hope maybe it'll be something more nutritious than brain candy, because there's been a lot of candy, but the time with family in terms of the holidays have been really good.
Yeah. And of course, me myself, I've been actually listening to quite a bit of podcast material, YouTube material over the last few days, in addition to spending with family. But I would say it's been a very good few days, and we're back into the saddle heading into the new year. So without further ado, let's get started.
Sounds good, Gray.
All right. So I guess first of all, Jeremy, we've had about 2 weeks since we did our program on Rick Wiles and TruNews and his call for a civil war in America, or basically his dream, his vision of what a civil war would look like, with all of the patriots rising up in opposition.
His dark dream, his dark prophetic dream, I guess.
Yes, and not the patriots rising up in opposition to the evil forces of the left that are doing so much to destroy America, and what we believe is the very weaponized language he uses to talk about the efforts, for example, to remove President Trump. And we've had a couple of weeks, benefit of hindsight, to kind of think about this and move and expand upon our thinking on that, maybe among ourselves. And I did a follow-up commentary where I added some insight on some posts, some comments that Rick Wiles had made about Islam, and also a few other things. And I gave some thoughts regarding that. And Jeremy, I guess with the benefit of about a little over 2 weeks since we did that recording, has there been anything you've been thinking about in regards to that since then, or any thoughts you've had, or anything that you maybe didn't express in our original broadcast that you are thinking about now?
Nothing core substantial that I think that I can't remember saying, but I continue to be convinced that the form that Rick Wiles' dissident speech takes, even through his transformations, it's textbook agit propaganda. It's the way that you would see it. I think you'd have to see it. And so, putting aside the question of why, or, the nature of the background of the agit propaganda, I think the form of it as agit propaganda should be seen very directly, and think about what that means: agitation, right? And so you could agitate for, actually, in fact, I was called an outside agitator. I was by the Fusion Center based former Kansas City police detective, who arrested me at the Kansas City Public Library in response to a Mondo Weiss article about it, and talking about me as a documentarian. He said, no, he's a peace activist with a long history as an agitator, right? So agitator, that's it's usually conceived as, from the Cold War, as like a Soviet, a communist agent who is taking advantage of certain aspects of social movements or American discontent, sowing radical discontent, I think is the way that it was talked about, how Abby Martin's show was talked about
I believe that was the quote from the DNI report.
Yes. And so agitation, right? Agitation. You can imagine, like, if people are sitting around and there's a fire in the house and the fire is getting more intense and people are either sleeping or not aware of it, then you might want to agitate them to wake up and do something about it. At the same time, of course, when you're dealing with what what our actual geopolitical emergency or crisis really is. It's a long form situation. And so you become suspicious over time of people whose political words are bent towards a sense of emotional long-term agitation rather than what we might call understanding, the power of knowledge and understanding that can then be turned into something like political strategy, right? So it more and more, like even like I just quickly saw a recent TruNews headline referencing, of course, the buildup of the North Korea tension in anticipation of Christmas, and the headline at TruNews was something about is Kim Jong-un's Christmas gift to the United States an interballistic nuclear-tipped missile or something to that effect, right? So to me, that brings me back, like, this is like raw stuff from like Alex Jones circa Y2K, really. And the vibe of it and is very agit propaganda. Some people may say, well, that's just a good headline that calls people's attention to it, and I'm not against writing good headlines, although I'm not good at it, obviously. That's not our, if there's serious criticism of us here at The Antidote, it's that we're not good, we're not professional enough in terms of our marketing or our wording or our presentation or our ability to, distill things down into a scintillating headline. At the same time, I would hope that what we've not, provided in that sense, we've also provided something else, which is the idea of a long-term investigation that leads to understanding and knowledge in a way that empowers people to be able to understand their world rather than feeling agitated, just perpetually agitated. So I would just point to that recent TruNews headline as indicative of what's actually going on there.
And I haven't been following TruNews in the last few days, but it looks like it might have been part of a December 23rd edition of TruNews titled "Better Watch Out, Kim Jong-un is Coming to Town."
I didn't see that one.
It's got Kim Jong-un on a horse with a Santa hat on and a nuclear mushroom in the background.
Oh, boy.
Mushroom cloud. So very interesting. And also in a similar light on their I want to get this day correct. I believe it might have been the December 18th edition of TruNews, which was titled, I want to make sure I got this right here. I believe it was December 18th, titled "Nuts or Nukes, America Roasting on an Open Fire," which was the December 18th broadcast. By the way, they're very good at coming up with creative titles. I'll definitely give them that. And part of this show was a warning from Russia that they see NATO's war drills as a provocation toward World War III. And honestly, that's fair enough to talk about. I mean, a British newspaper, I believe the Times of London, with the headline cover story about Russia, a top Russian military official saying that they talk about NATO war drills. I mean, that's fair game to discuss. But then it turns into Wiles talking about how he always gets a very, very uneasy feeling around the holidays. And it's his fear that this year, that while everybody's distracted by trying to remove the president and all the hysteria that's going on, that we may be at war with Russia by Christmas. I mean, I personally don't see much productivity coming out of a conversation like that. And one of the things that this does with the North Korea thing is it reinforces this narrative of like North Korea as this boogeyman threat. And to be honest with you, I can't quite make out what's going on with North Korea, because I certainly don't buy the MSM hysteria that we get so much of the time about North Korea as this horrible place where they can't even feed their people, but seem to have the means to actually harm Americans with nuclear weapons if they were given the opportunity to, and the constant fear-mongering that goes on about North Korea. But on the other hand, there's a lot of deep history there with North Korea that I don't think we've quite really gotten to as far as really getting a historic understanding of the nature of the North Korea threat, which to me feels very manufactured, but there's a lot more to it than I think either you or I know at this point. I think that's something for future consideration to keep looking into.
Yeah, and I would just want to just re-reference something that I brought up, maybe it was maybe at least a couple years ago, I think, was that I remember seeing something. I've never been able to find it again, but it was some leak. Maybe it was WikiLeaks, some aspect of WikiLeaks, but some high level U.S. ambassador talking about the North Korea situation and basically saying the way that North Korea acts as an sort of agent provocateur of the Pacific theater, that if North Korea didn't exist, we would have to invent it. It was sort of the thrust of the comment, and so that to me reminds me a lot of like the is North Korea the sort of like the Al Qaeda or the ISIS of the international community, unquote. And I found that the headline that I was referencing to is called "Is Kim Jong Un's Christmas surprise going to be a nuclear tipped ICBM?" And I'm wondering whether that Nuts and Nukes show is the one where they actually played the C-SPAN Epstein calls that included mine, and then somehow figured out how to avoid the actual factual substance that I brought up about the actual Red Mafia and that whole background connecting the Russian-Israeli axis. Somehow avoided that, talking about it for minutes on end.
For sure. Although I will point out, I will say that follow-up call with the caller from New Mexico talking to Epstein about the basically,
or Dershowitz,
basically almost beginning to sympathize with his plight, but then bringing up all of the crimes that Epstein was guilty of, and Dershowitz's complicity in helping Epstein cover it up. I will say that was very interesting for a couple of reasons, and one, that it was good to get Dershowitz basically really sweating about that particular topic on national television, and also the proximity of the New Mexico caller to the Epstein's Zorro Ranch and all of the New Mexico connections there. But you're right in that TruNews definitely did not really address the first call. To their credit, they played your call, but they really didn't have very much to say about that one. And while that second call was a really good one, it was framed in a way that much easier, I think, fits the conventional wisdom narrative that's through so much of the alternative media of the Epsteins as Israeli agents, and Epstein as an Israeli agent, and crimes against children, which of course are all very important. It's all very important to understand, but it leaves out a lot of stuff regarding the nature of, I think, regarding other elements of the Epstein operation, or possible elements of the Epstein operation that we're beginning to uncover, which I think some of it comes out of this interview with Ed Opperman. What was the name of the Epstein whistleblower?
He's not really a whistleblower. He's actually a
confidant.
A confidant, yeah. The Hoffenberg, right?
His best friend at one point. Yes, Hoffenberg's his name. And I have yet to listen to those interviews, but I hear that they are must-listen material. So,
well, you have to decipher what's actually being said there, and that's of course the guy who had set up Towers Financial, where Epstein sort of made his big first independent move in terms of high finance and criminal aspects of high finance. And Hoffenberg dropped some very interesting aspects, including that Rudy Giuliani was a prime lawyer for Towers Financial, and Hoffenberg, in I think it's the second interview that he did with Opperman, talks about who Rudy Giuliani was actually serving. And then one last little piece here is he talks about the background of Trump, Epstein, and what is this big real estate sale that we've talked about before. Rybolovlev, the Russian fertilizer king, who buys Trump's Florida real estate for almost, I think, twice the price that Trump paid for it just a few years after. And that original purchase, I think it was Abe Gosner is the name, but double check that Trump and Epstein were supposedly, fighting each other in a bidding war to purchase this key piece of real estate. But the way that Hoffenberg puts it basically is that this was Epstein actually enabling or catalyzing a payment of some sort to Donald Trump from the Russian oligarch, Russian mob set, really, via Rybolovlev, and that the actual fallout was not over their alleged fighting over this deal, but was actually on the back end of it, where apparently Epstein was either shorted on his payment, his finder's fee or whatever it may have been, and or some kind of aspect of the the disclosure agreement or something like that, and that was what caused the quote unquote breakup of Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. And so I would say if this is the case there, that Epstein actually facilitated this very blatant, obvious enrichment of Trump via, the Russian fertilizer king Rybolovlev, who, by the way, I believe this is also the case. Greg, weren't we just reading this before? I think this was in Proof of Conspiracy, that not only Oleg Deripaska, but Rybolovlev had worked with Joel Zamel, the Australian-Israeli psychological operations corporate czar of some sort, who is in the midst of this Middle East Israeli connection to the 11/9 Trump 2016 operation. So yes, there you go. So there is the, if someone wants to really run down the Russian connection to the Epstein operation, there is a very, very blatant and open factual piece of it down there in Florida, real estate, Trump, Epstein, and Rybolovlev.
Yes, and I believe that was we had first heard of this connection from Josh Reeves when he was getting into a lot of the very interesting facets of the Epstein operation. And I don't know if it's really been reported on very much anywhere else, maybe up until this recent interview on the Opperman report that we're referring to here.
Yeah, about the Epstein involvement in the facilitation of that. I mean, the real estate deal, we've been talking about it for a long time itself, because this was the guy, Rybolovlev, whose jet was following Trump throughout the 2016 campaign. And so, but then, yes, this is the sort of a key piece of this in terms of Josh Reeves reporting, especially when he was talking about the Doronin and then the other Russian special forces connection to Epstein that was drawn out, and then
through his primary bodyguard, I believe.
Yes, I can't quite remember the name, but we parse some of that out in one of our Epstein shows, and then now this Opperman reporting.
The bodyguard, by the way, is named Igor Zinoviev.
Zinoviev, right. And think about that guy. That guy's more than just a body guy. That guy drove Epstein around. He was not only he was not only a bodyguard, but a driver. He was like a chief of, a mob chief of staff, you might think of it, right? The controlling access, probably knowing everywhere where Epstein's going, coming and going. So, and Russian special forces. So that's a key piece, or former Soviet special forces. So that's a key piece right there that should be factored into all of this. And then, of course, this Israeli military intelligence front and center aspect of the Epstein operation that Dershowitz tried to laugh away.
Yes, for sure. And so just some things there to be taken into consideration with Epstein, and maybe, just like in with so many other things, hopefully more, I have a strong feeling based on history that more and more will continue to come out and be revealed about Epstein over the coming months and years. And so that's there's a lot more about Mr. Epstein and those behind him and those who made all of his criminality possible that is not yet known, and will hopefully over the years more and more will be exposed of that. And so that was a little side tangent we got off on with relation to Rick Wiles and the nature of that phone call of the C-SPAN phone calls to Dershowitz that were played on his program, and then the nature of not addressing your call at all, and instead choosing to focus on that second call. So just wanted to throw that in there. And even the framing of North Korea, it's something that's very common within alternative media, is that on one hand, even people who very much will present themselves as being opposed to like U.S. Warmongering and aggression will also, especially on the right, will also play into the play into the threat of North Korea. And while I haven't listened to it, it wouldn't surprise me if it's framed in the and I should listen to it to be fair. But in many cases, like what you said with Alex Jones, even people who will and I'll pass off judgment on exactly how Wiles portrays the North Korea threat until after I listen to it. But even based on what you said about Alex Jones, there's a tendency within these kind of right wing conspiracy media that even acts as if, at least publicly acts as if they're opposed to U.S. Foreign policy and U.S. War agendas, will always portray these threats in the way of North Korea, like we'll keep alive this boogeyman nature of the North Korea threat, while also presenting like the left and those who want America to be weak or are not going to protect us from the real enemies that are out there. So that's another aspect of the way that like boogeyman threats like North Korea are treated. And one more thing I want to say with Wiles, I'm looking on the TruNews website right now, and this is interesting. And again, I'll have to listen to this before I make full judgment on the nature of the conversation. But on the Christmas edition of TruNews, just yesterday, it was a Christmas special with Brenda Crouch. Now, who is Brenda Crouch? Brenda Crouch is the wife of Paul Crouch Jr., who is the son of the founder of the Trinity Broadcasting Network, Paul Crouch. And if you remember through previous programs, as reported on the TruNews website, Rick Wiles was very much, in addition to helping get cable contracts for Pat Robertson's network, which made the Christian Broadcasting Network and the 700 Club a national fixture on cable television. When the rise of cable in the 80s, he was also very much involved in doing similar work for Trinity Broadcasting Network and helping getting it launched on all of the major satellite providers. So this is the wife of the son of the founder of Trinity Broadcasting, Paul Crouch. This is Paul Crouch Jr.'s wife. And while Paul Crouch Jr. looking into a little bit of basic research on him, actually had a falling out with Trinity Broadcasting. It appears over issues related to finances and is actually no longer a part of what his parents started. I find it interesting, and I'll have to look more into the nature of who Paul Crouch Jr. is and the kind of talking points that he and his wife represent. But it's interesting that the TruNews crew is still on close speaking terms, it would seem like, doing an entire Christmas show with the wife of the son of the founder of Trinity Broadcasting. I'd be interested to know the nature of that, and I'll have to do some more looking into that. But that is interesting just on the surface, because I look on Paul Crouch Jr.'s just a basic glance through his social media feed, is having lunch with Mike Huckabee in Israel and other things. So I look at Brenda Crouch's social media, and there's quite a few references to Israel just simply looking on the surface of it. So I'd be interested to know the nature of some of those relationships that are kept alive. So in addition to the way Wiles continues to talk about people like Robert Jeffress as being persecuted victims of the liberal media. So
it's reminiscent of the relationships that Alex Jones maintained with people like Roger Stone or Jerome Corsi, for example. And I would just also point out that I thought you did an interesting conversation with Adam Green, and one of the interesting areas where you all broke it down was in terms of, and this was of course what was ignored on TruNews, was how Dershowitz, after I basically accused them of being a potential like Russian-Israeli access agent of some sort, he quickly denied that, but didn't spend that much time on that, really. His main point that he seemed really serious in impressing upon C-SPAN viewers was that any idea of a Russian-Israeli axis was geopolitically insane because they're basically virtually enemies. So I think that's sort of interesting in terms of these circles where there's supposedly Rick Wiles is an enemy of the Jewish deep state in the United States of America, and yet somehow the network is maintaining these kinds of relationships there, and then are being given press passes to the White House and press passes to AIPAC. AIPAC has apparently now rescinded that. They're not going to be giving TruNews another press pass for next year, so they'll have to find another way to interview Donald Trump Jr., I guess. And so I think that these kinds of, maintenance of these networks where on the surface there's apparently someone's an enemy of someone else, but also apparently just under the surface, these apparently, political odd bedfellows are still just friendly, like Jeffries and Rick Wiles.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems to me also, I don't know if I pointed this out when we talked before, but after his defense of in his discussion of Robert Jeffress, this is, by the way, on the same edition of TruNews where he discussed Mark Levin referring to Donald Trump as the first Jewish president at the Hanukkah celebration. And it's interesting what he said about Mark Levin was that, he basically said he likes Levin, but he wishes that Levin would stop listening to the rabbis. That was very interesting commentary. I thought maybe, Rick Wiles would want to point out Mark Levin's history of being a primary Zionist agent operating on and influencing the right-wing conservative movement in the United States, as well as his roots in the Reagan administration under Edwin Meese, who was up to his eyeballs in the promise treason.
Yes, right. And so then what you begin to see is this same...
And maybe he doesn't know that, but I have kind of a hard time believing he would be ignorant to that information. But who knows?
It's interesting that what comes along with these sort of strange bedfellows of defending Trump not in a direct fashion all the time, but in a sort of underlying meta political fashion, is it's always seems to come back to the same network too. This Iran Contra, the CNP network of some sort. And so if they were deeply involved in all of that promise and then the run up to September 11th, then what is their involvement in this Trump operation, this 11/9 operation subsequently?
And hold that thought, because I want to get right back to that. What you just pointed out there with this strange bedfellows relationship. I want to get back to that in just a minute, as it will be a great springboard into what we're going to primarily discuss here over the last 60 minutes or so that we're here. But and one more point about Wiles is going to finish this point on his defense of and mentioning Mark Levin, but not talking about Trump like that. And by the way, Rick Wiles has expressed hope for both Levin and Netanyahu, and that he hopes Netanyahu could be saved and find Christ, and also that he hopes that Mark Levin will stop listening to the rabbis. There's a common sentiment being expressed there, that they're both possibly good men underneath, but they're being duped by by the evil Jewish those who they listen to, as far as who influence their religion and their Jewish religious leanings. And so,
the only issue with Mark Levin is he's listening to the quote unquote rabbis too much. And I mean, isn't it interesting though that then Levin is actually this mouthpiece for Netanyahu? As we dealt with also when we did our show about how the Talpiot program operates, or how it works, was Netanyahu for the first time really directly telling of the American audience via Mark Levin that this long-term high technology strategy was a specific strategy that Netanyahu had been. He puts himself at the center of it as the agent of creating it, as somehow the way he described it was a combination of good old school Soviet industrial academic engineering types combined with the best of American Silicon Valley high-tech capitalism. And so that was Mark Levin. And so it is interesting then that Rick Wiles, not only in his show about the quote-unquote Jew coup, that had there at the very end, he expressed a little bit of human sympathy, as you pointed out, towards Netanyahu, but then also this question of Mark Levin. And that is obviously some kind of communications axis of some point, Netanyahu to Mark Levin, to communicate with the American people about the Israeli high technology strategic long-term takeover.
And that's in addition to Mark Levin being the person who basically broke the story of the Obama administration spying on the Trump campaign. That, so from what I can see, that pretty much originated from claims that Mark Levin was making on his radio program that were picked up by Breitbart and the rest of the conservative right-wing media, and then became this the springboard for this massive scandal that's been the one of the focal points of the defense of Trump over the last 2.5 years, and that was the Obama administration's complicity in going after the Trump campaign to try, as part of this deep state effort, overarching, all-encompassing deep state effort to stop Trump and everything about him. But you'll never hear Rick Wiles express those kind of sentiments. At least I haven't, about, say, Adam Schiff or George Soros. It's kind of interesting that he has that kind of rhetoric regarding Netanyahu and Mark Levin. But meanwhile, with George Soros, it's more of just, that's not to say they don't condemn Netanyahu and Israel, because of course they do. And that's very obvious. They've done good work in terms of their basic criticisms of Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians. And a lot of it, elements of its control over U.S. politics is obviously very, very well done. But there's still the very guarded variety, very Arthur Finkelstein-esque talking points about George Soros being this all-powerful demonic figure who's just out to destroy everything good and right in the world. And then the last point on the Robert Jeffress defense was it was all over Robert Jeffress publicly saying that all non-professing Christians are destined to eternity in hell. And I started to think, well, is this the defense of it? Because then Weil starts naming off a bunch of other Christian televangelist types like John Hagee and various others, challenging them to follow their brother Jeffers and proclaim the truth, as if, I wonder, is that the litmus test for what makes a good evangelical, even a good Zionist Israel shill evangelical, to the level of Robert Jeffress, who's been awarded by Michael Evans' Friends of Zion group?
Who was there also, we should point out, on the quote-unquote Hanukkah celebration, the signing of the Trump executive order. There's Michael Evans in the background. And, I mean, we're all aware of this question of sort of pseudo-Christian Zionist agit propaganda via people like Jeffries and all of that. But now I think we're going to have to start factoring in the idea of an anti-Zionist Christian agit propaganda that seems to be some of what Wiles appears to be doing while maintaining these kind of relationships of the same exact circles of some sort. And then final thing I just wanted to point out too, that as you pointed out with the question of the sort of the cartoonification of the attack on George Soros, who again it was a very strange moment, remember, when Yair Netanyahu, the son of Benjamin Netanyahu, put out the gif of Soros as the sort of evil, all-powerful Jew controlling his dad's enemies, really.
Yes. To the point that the Daily Stormer of what, as you call him, Meyer Amschel Anglin, Andrew Anglin, and the Daily Stormer proclaimed itself to be on its header on the front of its website the world's #1 Yair Netanyahu fan site. And of course, when Yair Netanyahu visited the U.S. earlier this year on his speaking tour, kind of hobnobbing with all of the top right-wing pro-Trump activists, who was one of the people he was photographed with? Tucker Carlson. He was boasting all about his photo op with Tucker Carlson all over his social media. So.
But Tucker Carlson is a good reformed neocon warmonger. He's now a paleocon libertarian constitutionalist.
Yeah, sure he is. LOL. But so I guess in wrapping up our thoughts here about this True News thing, there's just too many things that are missing from a narrative of somebody who just 5 years ago was calling for Mecca and Medina Muslim holy sites, and there's no good faith in that, by the way. That is not something a person of good faith advocates for, as far as I'm concerned. But even just taking that apart and all of the other the agitation against Islam, and very much repeating this narrative during the Obama administration, when this narrative of Obama being a closeted Sharia law supporting radical jihadist was all over the right wing alternative media. For somebody who just less than 5 years ago, as a matter of fact, you can go back 3.5 years ago to find him saying that all Muslims need to be, Islam needs to be outlawed from the U.S. just after the Orlando shooting, which was so important in the Trump operation from a perspective of proving that Trump was right about the threats facing our country and how the left is protecting and shielding all of these radical terrorists from accountability through things like mass immigration and not vetting these people enough. And so for somebody who just 3.5 years ago was saying all this stuff, there's too much missing from his narrative to ignore as far as seeing him as some type of like truth disseminating whistleblower against the kind of people he used to, at least on the surface, want you to believe he used to associate with. So
yeah, and it does seem that like when there's that kind of continuity of agit propaganda, that the form sort of stays the same. Rick Wiles, I don't think, has had his moment yet of the flip side, right, of his call for a nuclear attack on Muslim lands in terms of his, in terms of calling for it in a Jewish context. The agit propaganda form is still very, very much there, especially in relationship to the sort of the idea of cloaking in a so-called prophetic manner what is really just Alex Jones style agit propaganda of the Civil War is just around the corner, or the Bolshevik, the Tricoms and combination of the liberals are coming to, put you in the FEMA camps. That is not the kind of knowledge, or even, let's say, wisdom, the kind of wisdom that we actually need to both help produce within ourselves and also catalyze politically at this moment. We need to really have a politics that is strategic and committed, with a plan in mind for us to begin discussing how are we going to make things right, rather than just playing into the hyper agitation of the sort of either calling for mass violence or the the alleged prophesizing of mass violence that's just right around the corner.
Or even putting the imaging of it in people's heads in a way that is designed, obviously, to get an emotional reaction out of people. And of course, they could always say, well, we don't actually mean it, and maybe they don't actually mean it, but it's even putting that out there in such a public light in a way that is going to get an emotional response out of people. And I still stand by what I said, that kind of stuff is going to be could very well be used to blame for sources, for culprits if and when another domestic terrorism incident takes place, whether it's a psychologically based one like the CNN MAGA bomber, or a very real case of violence such as an event at a place like what we saw in Pittsburgh. It's setting up people like Rick Wiles to be at least partially blamed for inspiring things like that through their rhetoric. And whether that's fair or not, I don't know, but it's just a consequence of, I think, peddling in that kind of rhetoric. So,
and I would just point out also one last time that my analysis of it is that it's fraudulent on both sides. It's not actually a truthful analysis. I don't believe there's actually a threat of civil war, partially because of what I pointed out before, that if you think about it as a left-right divide kind of thing, that you're talking about a country that is, yes, there's the coasts are much more quote unquote blue, and yes, the middle of the country is more quote unquote red. But the United States of America is very mixed politically, actually. And so I think that is actually a fraud. And yes, it does set up the kind of actual threat situations of things like, terrorist acts of some sort that can easily be then blamed in a stochastic fashion on the Rick Wiles and who he claims to speak for from the Christian and patriot right at some level. And then no matter what the actual truthfulness of the analysis, that is what agit propaganda actually is. And it's the worst form of agit propaganda, meaning that it's actually, like you said, it's using images of violence And this the deepest criticisms of Alex Jones is a long term, not just because of his covering for Zionism and Jewish power, but a long term disinformationist has to do with the analysis of his violent language and the way he uses violent images pervasively and perpetually to basically put in his listeners' heads. And anyone who's listened to Alex Jones over periods of time understands that there is an emotional destabilization that comes along with that exact kind of just thinking about the way that he's talking to it's just sort of like to me. The political motive of that is to destabilize people from actually grounding themselves in a truthful analysis and beginning to make certain kinds of moves, political moves, that are grounded and that are that have a certain amount of a time scheme in the future where someone is not going to just sort of give it up and try to run to the hills and hunker down in avoidance of the just around the corner civil war, nuclear war, FEMA camps for the Christians and the Patriots. That is exactly the way that Alex Jones and his ilk have operated to destabilize and neutralize in a political fashion and spiritually neuter those of good faith on the right who should take on that proud mantle of being an American Christian and an American patriot.
I could not agree with you more in that. And I guess I'll finish this part of the conversation by making a comparison in some ways maybe between Wiles and Alex Jones, and similar rhetoric is that, well, what's really the difference between Rick Wiles circa 2014, 2015, 2016 calling for preemptive nuking of Muslim holy sites so that we can get to them before they try to get to us with their terrorism, and then now calling for a Goyim uprising against the Jewish debauchery masters, and also the images and the fantasizing the dreams of a bloody domestic civil war where all of the American Christian patriots rise up against this effort to remove our president and to send us into a Bolshevik-style bloodbath of Christians. And I ask you, what really, and now Wiles is, at least on the surface, is very much not as publicly critical of Islam or Muslims as he once was, certainly not on his programs. But I hearken it back to what Alex Jones was saying on Y2K, that, Vladimir the Ruthless and the Russians are planning to attack America, and that as a result of this, there's this mass hysteria on Y2K where all the banks are running out of money and the gas stations are running out of fuel and the supermarkets are running out of groceries, and there's mass blackouts, none of which appears to actually have been going on September 11th. And let's fast forward where 19 years later, where instead of being the big villain, Vladimir the Ruthless, a creation of the CFR and the Trilateral Commission, now it's Vladimir Putin, the heroic stander up for Christian values and for morality, but it's the evil deep state left that is planning all of these types of mass calamities that he was trying to pin on the newly elected Vladimir Putin back on Y2K. So
very interesting point, Greg.
All right, so you mentioned a few minutes ago, and I wanted to go back to this when we were talking. You talked about the strange Bedfellows alliance within this pro-Trump media activism circles. And I just recently finished, and this might be another factor to understanding Rick Wiles, by the way, is the Council for National Policy. And I am right now in the middle. I'm on part 4 of a 7-part series that John Brisson, his YouTube channel is We've Read the Documents, has put together on the Council for National Policy and its history. And one of the things that and I think this is important when it comes even to someone like Rick Wiles and into the broader scope of what we're going to talk about here, is that one of the things John Brisson pointed out is that the CNP very much appears to be a nexus, a sort of combination of the very Zionist right, but also factors within the anti-Zionist right. And he points out such things as the Regnery family and their funding of people like Richard Spencer and possible connections to the Liberty Lobby and Willis Carto and the aspects that came out of there that have been very influential on the right over the years. And then the Regnery's financing, he didn't mention this on air, but also the financing of the group that of I believe it's the Charles Martel Institute, which Kevin MacDonald is directly affiliated with. And Kevin MacDonald, through his writings, has served the purpose of painting the conspiracy, as far as like the Jewish conspiracy against against the right wing, as being primarily a neoconservative of the very Bill Kristol ilk of neocons, as opposed to taking in this bigger picture that I think the Council for National Policy is very key to. But there's this long-term history of, not only within the CNP and through its various predecessors, such as the John Birch Society and others, not only is it a coming together platform for the just the very Zionist right, but also a lot of what is known as the anti-Zionist right, through things such as the Regnery family. And although the Regnery family has launched the careers of many right-wing Zionist-leaning commentators and other people through book sales and through putting a lot of major conservative movement figures on the map with by publishing their books and other properties, you have this, there's the support of people like Richard Spencer, and there's support and money going into aspects of the eugenics movement that does have a very real history outside of the very, sometimes possibly not the greatest way of describing what types of things such as the eugenics movement would actually be looking to achieve. But there is this very real history of both of these aspects coming together. And I would say that just as not everyone in the John Birch Society is like a frothing at the mouth Zionist who's affiliated with it, not everyone who's with the Council for National Policy is a frothing at the mouth crazed Zionist. And I'll just point out a couple of coming together meeting points between aspects of the CNP and then what you see with this Russian and Israeli kind of coming together of just theocratic, dominionist, maybe very Zionist, but also not as Zionist, or on the flip side of it, just very much anti-Zionist types that are that hold similar kind of global political and social beliefs and goals and agendas. One thing is John Brisson pointed out the speech of Rand Paul to the Council for National Policy back in 2015 when he was running for president. And I believe this is actually a separate program outside of the 7-part series. This is actually a specific audio that John Brisson did focusing on Ron and Rand Paul and their connections to the Council for National Policy. And one of the things that Brisson pointed out was just how seamlessly Rand Paul was able to fit in with this very with the Council for National Policy, which is seen as obviously being very Zionist. But when you look at Rand Paul, outside of things such as just going to Israel and putting his hand on the Wailing Wall, which was obviously very disappointing for us to see back in 2013, and Rand Paul obviously not getting to the bottom of what Israel's doing in the world. For example, leaving Israel out of his analysis of countries that are hostile to Christians as a means of justifying the cutting off of aid to countries that persecute Christians. He never seems to mention Israel when it comes to that. But also, it would not be fair to describe Rand Paul as like this Israel first or even a Zionist politician, because at the end of the day, I really don't think he is. And if you want an example of somebody in American politics who is really towing what appears to be a Russian line rather than an Israeli line at the end of the day, I would look at someone like Rand Paul. But Brisson makes the point that Rand Paul he fits in with this very Zionist CNP crew just as easily as the obvious, very warmongering, war against everybody types would fit in with them. And he seemed to be very, very chummy with this group. So that's one example I would give. And then another one I would give, which might even get us a little closer to the possible continuing relationship at some level going on between Rick Wiles and some of the obvious more Zionist evangelicals, is the relationship when it comes to Russia of top evangelicals within the Council for National Policy, such as the Family Research Council of Tony Perkins. And it should be noted that Tony Perkins, who's in addition to being the head of the Family Research Council, which also includes, I mention this anytime I mention the FRC, Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin, who, according to Alex Jones, is said to be at the center of the Delta Force coup that got Trump into office, the tip of the spear and all that, and also Kenneth Blackwell of 2004 election chicanery infamy. But the Family Research Council, while I've read documents and articles from Ken Blackwell that paint Russia as this geopolitical adversary to the U.S. as a justification to spend on defense and a strong military, you also have this very much this the interest of these evangelical culture warrior hardliners lining up with Russia, whereas in the Family Research Council has been very supportive of Russian efforts to outlaw what's called pro-gay propaganda, and how this is what we need to do, and this is a good spiritual ally for us to follow. And I should also point out the allegations that I believe it was David Duke was alleged to have sold membership lists to Tony Perkins when Tony Perkins was still a state politician in the state of Louisiana back in the late 90s. So these are a couple of examples of a very much a continuum that I don't think is taken into consideration when we think of just the Council for National Policy. For what little is known about it, there's still very little known about it and reported about it in comparison to the obvious groups such as the Council on Foreign Relations. And I honestly, as bad as this group is, I'm kind of appreciative that the Southern Poverty Law Center published this membership list of the CNP back in 2016 in the lead up to the 2016 election, because it really shed a lot of light on this group. And for those who can really read between the lines and know what the Steve Bannons and the David Bossies and the Mercers represented and continue to represent in relation to Trump, it's a very useful piece for people to have. And that's something that, unlike the CFR, the CNP never releases its membership lists. And so this aspect of it, where the CNP is not just a meeting point for the obvious crazed Zionist evangelicals, but even for people who really aren't on the same wavelength, that don't have the same type of passion or advocacy for Zionist and pro-Israel causes, that come together with the aforementioned Zionists in this more of this shaping the globe and shaping the United States in particular and the globe in general in their direction in terms of politics, in terms of social policy and other areas. And so this is important. I don't think it's taken into consideration enough. And this could be looked at as a meeting point for the interest of a lot of these very obvious Israel firsters and those who aren't so much. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
And it's interesting that
was a mouthful.
There's a lot there, Greg, and it's a very interesting topic. And what immediately popped in my mind when you brought up the Council for National Policy in relationship to the Southern Poverty Law Center was Max Blumenthal, who is one of the few left journalists who actually went to a meeting. He somehow got in. He hasn't said who helped him get in, but he went to a meeting, and you've now pointed out that his father, right, Sidney Blumenthal,
yes,
a generation earlier, had been at the epicenter of exposing, CNP types around people like Oliver North. And so what's interesting too, and we'll probably have to touch on this on another future opportunity, but this question of the Southern Poverty Law Center in relationship to Max Blumenthal and the attack article that had been published at Southern Poverty Law Center. And so, at those kinds of things, you begin to wonder, like, okay, there's an exposing of it by such a controlled entity or an attack entity as the Southern Poverty Law Center, whether that actually ends up being a bad jacketing of some sort of actually some of this crucial information, whether it's crucial information about the apparent hypocrisy of Max Blumenthal's political background, or if it's the important information about such things as the list of membership of the Council for National Policy.
And that's a great point. And by the way, I'm not putting any kind of noble intentions for the SPLC in releasing that list. I'm just pointing out the fact that it was very beneficial to people who want to try to really have a further understanding of how the Trump operation came to be and what it represents in the role of this very, very influential conservative policy think tank that brings together pretty much directly and indirectly pretty much all of the major players in the conservative movement here in the U.S. as we know it. So on that,
Greg, will you just really quickly fill us in about what you had told me about, because when you brought up Boykin, the other name that comes up in me in terms of these circles is Paul Vallely, and you pointed out something very interesting about Paul Vallely.
Yes, and so I went back and looked at this as a result of our friend our friend Kevin Barrett interviewing Michael Maloof on his radio program. And people can go and check that out. And we certainly have our critiques of that interview as far as things that were and were not addressed with relation to Maloof's history and his stance on various issues such as the war on terror in general and where he stands on that. But anyway, it got me looking back into an article that we had both found from March of 2017 of Jerry Boykin talking with Michael Maloof and Paul Vallely together doing an interview about President Trump's Middle Eastern policy, and they were both saying that he's going to pursue better relations with Russia. And I basically got out of this was that they were, that Trump was willing to team up with Russia to actually defeat, the terrorists, which is a big part of this talking point narrative that we've gotten out of the, Russia stepping in after the U.S. and the Obama administration, the Clinton State Department did all this damage to Syria by empowering the jihadis to carry on their war and to and try to destroy Assad. But what I noticed in this at the very end that I didn't notice the first time was that this interview was done in March of 2017 by, I believe it was a Russian source, while both Maloof and Vallely were attending something called the Valdai Discussion Club. And it turns out the Valdai Discussion Club is very closely connected to the Russian government and to Vladimir Putin. And then I went to the Valdai Discussion Club's YouTube channel, and I found an interview with Paul Vallely where he's talking about the Trump administration. And there was an interesting question that was asked about to Vallely, among other things, about for example, Vallely, unlike Maloof, very much is in the camp of Iran hawks, as far as he was one of the most outspoken opponents of the Iran nuclear deal, and he maintains this narrative that Iran is a major threat to the U.S., unlike Michael Maloof, who is now somewhat preaching a policy of detente against Iran and calling out, at least in what I believe is very limited fashion, the nature of the U.S.-Israeli hawkishness against Iran. So Vallely maintains himself in very much publicly in this anti-Iran, very hawkish against Iran camp. He's asked a question about whether this stance that he has towards Iran, along with Russia's stance of much more dovishness on Iran, if those things could be reconciled. And Vallely basically said yes. But this brought up, in addition to the Valdai Discussion Club, this brought up a very interesting point to me that Gordon Duff, Kevin's colleague at Veterans Today, has alleged that that Paul Vallely, via Cheney's orders, was the person who went to the media and leaked Valerie Plame's identity as it relates to the outbreaking of the Iraq War and all the intrigue surrounding Plame and her husband Joe Wilson. And then it reminded me of Maloof, alleged by Franklin Foer in New York Magazine as being the primary source for Judith Miller's Iraq War propaganda. So I wanted to point that out, and that's a very, very interesting connection that I had noticed that I didn't notice the first time I looked at this article of Paul Vallely and Michael Maloof. And one more thing real quick about Vallely and Maloof is that Vallely was one of the primary people pushing the idea of this Obama purging the military of patriots. And with the benefit of hindsight, this pretty much indicates to me that Vallely, this type of talking point, which was very much pushed by Vallely, as well as Alex Jones, and Vallely's talking points on it were published by Michael Maloof in the pages on the WorldNet Daily, which Michael Maloof was still writing for at the time. This is circa 2015 or so. And very much appears to be Michael Flynn was at the center of that this was very much a Michael Flynn-centric talking point, that Obama was purging the patriots. And one of the patriots that was purged by Obama was Michael Flynn as the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And so that's very interesting, thinking of Vallely having a spot at this Russian, very Putin-centric think tank, along with Michael Maloof, as well as Michael Flynn and all those connections that are well documented with Russia and the highest rankings of the Russian military intelligence.
That's a key point, too, that you're making about the background of during the Obama administration in terms of these kind of people like Vallely, because you can then begin to see that what it really looked like was being done in terms of the quote-unquote purging of the patriotic military types. It actually looks like there was some kind of pushback about what you might call a dominionist, like a heavily Zionist Christian apocalyptic types in high aspects of military command, mainly U.S. Air Force.
And on that topic, remember it was Boykin who was basically forced out during the Iraq War when he made the speech about, we're basically waging a religious war against Islam.
Right. And so that all fits in with the people who backed Trump about what he's set up to be the leading savior of the Christian people in the United States because he's willing to name the enemy, which is extremist terrorists, right? And that whole idea of the name them, even think about that then as, in the Wiles flip into naming the Jew. So it's all about the sort of it's almost a sorcery kind of scenario about a magical, naming the enemy as the way to dispel them in certain ways. And this all then fits in with this Zionist agit propaganda. And then obviously, as you're pointing out too, there's some kind of weird Zionist, anti-Zionist horseshoe of some sort. And then final point I just wanted to make about what you brought up around this background of Valerie as reported to have outed Valerie Plame, that it was this background of the Valerie Plame operation and how she'd been alleged to have been paid off by the movie that was made about her that starred Sean Penn as her husband, Joe Wilson, and Naomi Watts, I think, as Valerie Plame, that had been a payoff by the people who had forced her out, was said, and that turned out to have been Summit Entertainment, which is Arnon Milchan's vehicle with Andi Vanya, I think is how you say it, which is what led me and to point out to us, and then we began to do this research on this background of the Andi Vanya connection to to Viktor Orban, and this key Arnon Milchan, high-level long-term Lacham Israeli nuclear intelligence agent, Arnon Milchan, producer of the conspiracy theory movie about the JFK assassination, hooked up with Viktor Orban's media consolidation so-called right-hand man, Andi Vanya, yes. that was pointed out by this background of the Valerie Plame outing operation.
Yes, and Vanya was quoted, Milchan was quoted in Variety magazine, which is a top Hollywood-centric media publication in 1991, that Vanya is his best friend in Hollywood. And then you think about another example of strange bedfellows, and this is just going past even the right wing in terms of Zionist and anti-Zionist, is the relationship of Arnon Milchan with Oliver Stone via financing his JFK film, which obviously left Israel completely out of the narrative on possible culprits in the Kennedy assassination. Is Oliver Stone and the role he plays as not only a defender of, it seems, of Trump and particularly the Russia relationship on the left, but as an open Putin propagandist, you could call him, via documentary films he's made, a series of interviews he did with Vladimir Putin, and of course, Oliver Stone pops up on a Stephen Colbert show on CBS and says that it's Israel that's influencing American elections and not Russia. So that's another strange bedfellows relationship right there that is very interesting, the Zionists and anti-Zionists.
Yes, and because it was also Oliver Stone, who looks like he's like one of the few, if only, people who ever successfully called out Israel on Bill Maher's HBO show. And what is HBO again? Remember this HBO Time Warner connection, right? To the CNI, right?
Center for the National Interest. Richard Plepler, yes.
Richard Plepler, right? And then also Dimitri Simes, the administrative executive, until now. I guess he's out of the country in Russia as a government and media asset of some sort. Valdai Discussion Club, Dimitri Simes, Mifsud, the shadowy professor Joseph Mifsud, Valdai Discussion Club, right? So interesting. HBO, where all of that happens, and then Oliver Stone, as you pointed out now, this question about how does he go from being the director of the Israeli nuclear intelligence financed, the film about the assassination of American president to being the guy who's given direct, immediate access in a documentary fashion to Vladimir Putin to discuss 2016, the rise of cyber, right? That would also implicate the question of Talpiot, and it was not, there was no Israel in the mix in Stone's questioning of Vladimir Putin, let alone how he actually did not actually ask really the hard questions of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, that was a great point. As we begin to start to get in the process of wrapping up here, I wanted to finish up on the Blumenthals because I wanted to make this conversation. I'm glad we're actually expanding the scope of this conversation. I was thinking it was going to be primarily about the strange bedfellows on the right, so to speak, but we've brought very much through Oliver Stone and now also the Blumenthals, Sid and Max Blumenthal, the strange bedfellows that continues to show itself on the left as well. And one thing about the Blumenthal history, and I do want to dig into the Max Blumenthal SPLC. I think we're definitely planning on hopefully doing a program on that in the future, as we have a couple articles that I think are very revealing to read from and analyze regarding that whole thing. But the history and the relationship, and this has made me reevaluate the bigger relationship. Another show I think we're going to do in the future is a reevaluation of what we were talking about in 2017 with Hillary Clinton and the vast right-wing conspiracy and the movers and shakers in the anti-Clinton propaganda, both truthful and very weaponized, and I think very exaggerated to some level over the last couple of decades, and a reevaluation of that relationship as we've learned more things over the years, and the way that these Clinton and Trump operatives kind of very much Clinton and Trump / right-wing operatives, very strange way they kind of play off of each other. But with the Blumenthals, it is interesting that Sidney Blumenthal was able to, or via the Washington Post, was able to obtain a transcript of Oliver North at the Council for National Policy and printed that back in December of 1986, hat tip to John Brisson in his series for laying this information out. And then Max Blumenthal, 32 years later, manages to get into a CNP meeting and record a Nikki Haley speech to the Council for National Policy. So that's a very interesting continuum. And then when you even think about Rahm Emanuel referring to Sidney Blumenthal by the nickname Grassy Knoll because of his penchant for conspiracy theories, and then you look at how someone like Max Blumenthal is operating now in the age of Trump, and it's an extremely fascinating strange bedfellows. I look at it. It might not be as direct of a strange bedfellows relationship, but it seems to me that you have at least circumstantial evidence for there possibly being some type of strange bedfellows relationship there, bringing together the quote-unquote hard right and the quote-unquote hard left.
Very interesting point, and we definitely have to plumb these depths at some point, because what pops into my mind also immediately is, of course, Sidney Blumenthal as the apparent source early on of sort of calling in of really the Arthur Finkelstein style of the demonization of the political enemy as more important than actually standing for what you stand for politically. And that is Arthur Finkelstein's legacy, is that demonization politics. But Sidney Blumenthal being the one who really, it wasn't Alex Jones and Donald Trump who were the quote unquote birther, origins politically in terms of actually what was being operated at the high levels, but it was Sidney Blumenthal from within the bowels of the Hillary Clinton campaign back in 2007, 2008 against then candidate Barack Obama about questioning, the pictures of him in African garb and questions about his background and all of that. Yes. And again, there's a replication there. There's because of the similar kind of way where there's truth, there's questions of truth behind these deeper questions. There is, in a similar fashion, this serious questions about the background of the Clintons. And of course, Epstein is the epicenter of showing how the Clinton-Trump so-called split, lock her up, lock him up. It's in the middle of that is the Jeffrey Epstein network, and that the Clinton network via someone like Sidney Blumenthal was doing similar kinds of things, the controversialization of the attack politics, demonization politics. So that's interesting. And then the other thing that I thought of was Scheer Senator Cody Shear, who someone like Lee Stranahan, in attempting to avoid the actual factual analysis of what's actually said and in the Steele dossier, a lot of it looks to be pretty good in intelligence, raw intelligence analysis, especially if you look at the core of it, of things such as the Trump administration is happy to have the aura of the Trump-Russia investigation, as long as it doesn't have to answer questions about its compromise and corruption in relationship to big world powers such as China or others, i.e., Israel, right? So that's there, and someone like Lee Stranahan at Sputnik News, formerly Breitbart, formerly Huffington Post, I guess, he's always talking about this connection. He's sort of smearing the Steele dossier as allegedly coming from the Cody Shear dossier, who's a close friend and ally, political ally to Sidney Blumenthal. So once again, you have this sort of the cloaking of these matters in a way that's meant to sort of controversialize and muddy up the waters, where there's actually some serious analysis and some factual uncovering that needs to be done.
Yeah, there's so much I strongly agree with you, and there's a lot to dissect from what you just said right there that could be worthy of a full show. But yeah, Lee Stranahan, and to be fair to Lee, there's probably some truth in that being at some level a hatching out of these Sidney Blumenthal, Cody Shearer type operatives. But I think you and I would come to a much different conclusion as to the actual possible nature of that than Lee Stranahan would do. And so in the Blumenthal, with relation to Sidney Blumenthal's allegation of Obama being born in Kenya as being the originator of that came from a former Washington bureau chief for McClatchy newspapers by the name of, just one moment here, I'm pulling up the name. The former McClatchy newspaper editor was named, I believe his name is James Asher, excuse me. He tweeted back in September 2016 that Sidney Blumenthal told him in person that Obama was born in Kenya. And this would seem to match up with the kind of, the Clinton campaign's efforts to dig up dirt on their rival, Barack Obama, and the fact that it was another example of possible strange Bedfellows relationship is that a lot of these more obviously extreme Zionist right-wingers of the Joel Gilbert Dreams of My Real Father, Jerome Corsi variety, very much picked up on and weaponized in a way that just made it, I think, very, very hard, if not impossible, to take serious inquiry into the actual nature of Barack Obama's history and his connections that led to get him where he became ultimately as president. So there's some things to be sorted out there in terms of that whole history.
And it's almost like it's either red herrings as political attacks, and so people then don't actually get into the analysis of Barack Obama's heartland, I would call it, CIA family background. And to this day, I believe there is still a cover up of Barack Obama's origins, which are much closer to right here in Kansas and to areas around Topeka and such institutions as the Westboro Baptist Church and Barack Obama's CIA grandparents via his mom, rather than in Kenya. And by the way, one last piece of that whole thing is who then picked up on it was the Israeli-born dentist Orly Tates, who was one of the leading, proponents of the Obama birth certificate.
She was kicked out of a Breitbart meeting at CPAC for being "quote unquote" too extreme. So,
and one last thing I just do want to say again is, in a similar kind of replica of the way that the Nancy Pelosi-led Democrats are really running some kind of cover-up of the depths of the 11/9 operation in Trump-Russia, but it's not just Trump-Russia, right? And it's in large part, it seems to be this Israeli angle that seems to be the third rail of why the investigation is being limited via the Democrats. At the same time, as like people are talking about, the Steele dossier was funded by the Democrats in a way to try to, opposition research, to target Trump, to not allow him in. We should just point out that they barely even used it. And then also, it was originally came out of Republican. It was a Republican paid for research.
Yes, and this was used within like this was used by alt-right, David Duke types to paint this as proof that the neocons never wanted Trump, as that it originated from Bill Kristol's son-in-law's newspaper.
And go read back through the Steele dossier, quote unquote, and look if you read it with like the background of the kind of sourcing and research that we do at the Antidote, you can really see a lot in the midst there that was just sat upon by such organizations as the deep state FBI or the deep state Democrats and Hillary Clinton campaign, when there was so much actual material there to imagine Hillary Clinton, if she were actually a real enemy of Donald Trump, she could have been hitting him hardcore with the kind of research that they apparently had paid for. But I guess we don't even know the background of how that information was sat upon via the Democrats and the Hillary Clinton campaign, so that it actually, of course, was not really ever. When you look at it, you see whether it's the FBI who are accused of being the sort of the institutional epicenter of the deep state that's against Trump, or the Hillary Clinton Democrats, or the New York Times, as we pointed out over and over again. What you really see is they were the dogs that never barked over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that brings into question the reporting of people like Jay McKenzie on the history of Maggie Haberman, the New York Times #1 Washington reporter on all things related to Trump. So, and then one last point on Blumenthal, and I know you've got a limited window of time left, so I'm going to try to hurry up and finish on my last point here after I finish with Blumenthal, is that it's very interesting, a continuum here of Sidney Blumenthal is alleged to be the one primary person who initially pushed the Obama birther propaganda. It's picked up on by all these crazy, right-wing operatives in a very weaponized fashion. And then it's Max Blumenthal, who in the pages of publications such as Mother Jones and I believe The Nation as well at the time, was in the early years of the Obama administration, was the person who was on the left exposing these operatives for their ridiculous Islamophobic conspiracy theories about the president. So. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me, honestly.
Yeah, it was Max Blumenthal all over the left airwaves, Pacifica, KPFK in Los Angeles, who was comparing a 9/11 truth to quote unquote birtherism, right? And so there's another replication of Max Blumenthal as a leading attack agent on the left versus 9/11 truth.
Yeah, and you have your own personal run-ins with Blumenthal. I don't think we need to dig back into those right now, but we've talked about them on the air in the past. But, Blumenthal now says that Abby Martin, there's no hint of trutherism in her commentary, and he's willing to talk about Saudi Arabia, so I guess we're supposed to believe that he's a changed man now. I'm not believing it, and I'm not buying it.
Yeah, and there is a similar analysis that we will need to do in relationship to the anti-Zionism of someone like Max Blumenthal and his journalism in relationship to what we might call the anti-Zionism of the right and of the religious right, like Rick Wiles, where there's something else going on here behind the simplistic notion of these are just sort of anti-Zionists of good faith.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up here, I want to bring up a case of strange bedfellows. And I guess this is more of a broad conversation of the right and the left media that very much have a symmetry when it comes to issues related to Trump, as it comes to Russia and collusion and impeachment and efforts to really try to, I think, hold Trump and the people behind him and around him accountable for a lot of what they're able to get away with. But another example of this kind of strange bedfellows relationship, and I touched on this at the end of the Wiles commentary, and it may not have been the best time to really hammer home my point about all of these media operatives, all the way from Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Breitbart to the Rick Wiles and David Dukes on one side on the right, and then going even to the left of the Max Blumenthal, Jimmy Dore, Aaron Matei ilk, where they all just, I think, have very similar, almost lockstep talking points about this narrative of the deep state trying to, or the war party in the U.S., the deep state, the neoliberal class. If you listen to the left, or if you listen to the right, it's the deep state. It's the Jewish deep state. If you listen to Rick Wiles, or it's the globalist left socialist anti-Israel deep state, if you listen to it. And it's very funny, those combination of those talking points, by the way, but with differences and variations in the labeling of who the villain is or who the primary culprit is. I think it's very similar narratives coming out of pretty much any type of alternative media that is against this narrative of Trump and actually having done something wrong in relation to the very global nature, I think, of the actual 2016 operation to make sure that Trump was elected. And I want to finish up this conversation by bringing a couple of recent interviews that I listened to, one that I listened to, another that I heard about, that are very interesting in trying to. And I think something that we very simplistically try to do, I'm learning more and more about this, is try to label people operatives or agents for one particular country or one particular interest. And in some cases, like with Breitbart, for example, conceived in Israel, it's very obvious what they represent. But with other people, I don't think it's quite as simple. And one of these examples was Tucker Carlson. I haven't actually watched this interview, but Tucker Carlson, within the last month on his show, did an interview with a person who's running for Congress, I believe in the state of California, who's a self-identified member of the Groypers. And the Groypers is this group that is pretty much led by Nick Fuentes that goes to these events like Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA events and shout out things about, the Kirks being not real conservatives and shouting out stuff about Israel and Turning Point USA's obvious radical support of Israel, to the point that I call them Zio Point USA. But and then the combination of very much bringing in this social this culture war of the Jews as being the primary pushers of the degradation in our countries. And Tucker interviews a member of the Groypers, and then you also have Alex Jones interviewing E. Michael Jones. And by the way, with Alex Jones, I would recommend people check out the most recent interview Jones did with Dr. Steve Pieczenik. A number of very interesting talking points, a number of very interesting comments by Steve Pieczenik in the course of this about hour-long interview that Jones did with him, I believe, just this week. So I would recommend that. And we can even leave a link to this Pieczenik-Jones interview in the show notes. But anyway, Alex Jones interviewed E. Michael Jones at the end of November for about 45 minutes. And what stuck out to me very interesting is E. Michael Jones. By the way, E. Michael Jones seems to be the inspiration for a lot of these Groypers. And Nick Fuentes, through his commentaries of his social commentaries of the Jews being responsible for so many of the, what they see as the culturally destructive policies and pushing of various things. What stuck out to me is E. Michael Jones said pretty much everything in this Alex Jones interview that he would say to very friendly, anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish interviewers or people conducting interviews. He said pretty much everything that he would say in those interviews to Alex Jones. But what I particularly noticed, which was really interesting when you consider the way he treated you and me when we called into his show, and also the way that Adam Green was treated when he did an interview with Owen Schroyer, 2 interviews with Owen Schroyer, is that Alex Jones did not push back or even attempt to counterpoint E. Michael Jones even one time. I mean, he kept throwing in the caveat that, I'm not anti-Israel, but he kept agreeing with E. Michael Jones. And E. Michael Jones is talking about the Anti-Defamation League being founded as an organization to defend an alleged Jewish child rapist, Leo Frank. And he's talking about Israel dispatching pornography into Palestinian homes as a means of a psychological weapon during one of the Palestinian offensives back in 2002 or 2003. And Jones did not once push back here. So this is very interesting dynamic with Tucker Carlson interviewing an ostensibly anti-Jewish Groyper and Alex Jones interviewing E. Michael Jones in a very friendly way, is that I think in particular with Alex Jones, we have been very much caught up in this idea that Jones is just a Zionist propagandist and that InfoWars is Israeli propaganda. And I think that obviously a lot of that with Jerome Corsi being hired and going on air saying some of the things he said while he was with InfoWars, talking about sources above Mossad, giving him information to put out on InfoWars. And then obviously some of the rhetoric that Jones has been pushing about in the aftermath of the Israeli media or embassy ceremony of how the Palestinians are just violent savages and they don't need to, it's not a bad thing to put it in control of Israel because the Palestinians had it, they would just murder each other. And that fits into that bigger narrative, the very bigger anti-Muslim, pro-war on terror narrative that InfoWars has pushed over the last several years. But I think one of the things that Jones has been able to counter somewhat effectively, honestly, is this allegation that he's just an Israeli or Zionist agent. And to me, bringing on E. Michael Jones for a 45-minute interview to talk about and obviously the thing that brings them together is that it's the left. It's the left that is the source of so much of this debauchery and all this that they talk about. But that's not the indication to me of somebody who's just a Zionist Israeli agent. And Tucker Carlson, likewise interviewing a quote-unquote Groyper, you would not see that on Breitbart or the Sean Hannity show or the Rush Limbaugh show. So I think there needs to be a little bit of a distinction made here, and I think we need to maybe move beyond just simply labeling people. And there's obvious cases that are the exception, like with Breitbart, for example, or with some of these alt-right people who are very clearly, I think, acting as Russian agents of some type. But in some of these cases, though, it's not just as simple as so-and-so's an Israeli agent, so-and-so's a Russian agent, so-and-so's an agent of a different type of entity. But I think it's fascinating to continue trying to pinpoint where these narratives and these varying types of takes on subjects and types of interviews you won't hear on other sources from the likes of Alex Jones and Tucker Carlson, and continuing to pinpoint where their strange Bedfellows narratives come together, while at the same time just moving beyond just simply calling somebody. And as I said, there are exceptions, but just trying to pinpoint Alex Jones, for example, as an Israeli agent, I don't think it's nearly that simple.
Well, I do want to thank you for drawing out this. I've termed it that there's the idea that some of what we're doing with the antidote is we the people initiated and of, by, and for intelligence, meaning like an actual analysis of reality, what's actually going on, forensics, factual forensics of some sort, and then also this what you really bring hardcore to the table, Greg, is this what I've termed a we the people of, by, and for counterintelligence, i.e. looking at these big frameworks that's populated by individuals with names and people who have historical backgrounds, people who are paid by specific media platforms, but that the big part of it is an analytical framework, or these narrative environments, or the narrative horizons that you can begin to look at. And so I think it is a very interesting sort of closing point about this question of the Joneses interview, E. Michael Jones on Alex Jones. And then I would just close it by pointing out that with Jones as the sort of the hinge point here, you might consider that E. Michael Jones is sort of the patron saint, or at least the patron saint of the culture war aspect of the Groyper right, and then who is maybe the patron saint of like the anti-Jewish right? It's David Duke, Dr. David Duke, which you've really led the way in terms of some of our investigations around, Dr. Duke, the apparent spook background here, and so
how that matches up with the rhetoric, and I think the very, very much more important role than people, I think, realize that he's played in the Trump era as well. So
yes, and so it was. That's a key moment too, is when Alex Jones interviewed David Duke. That was antagonistic. That was sort of what the opposite of what you're pointing out, the way that he approached a sort of similar kind of narrative coming from, or a similar kind of analysis coming from E. Michael Jones. I would say, Jones obviously comes from a very religious background, and sort of Duke is more of there's a little bit more of a sort of a secularist sort of white.
Duke always makes sure to throw in the Christian throwing out the bones to his populist things like, Trump is being, he's being crucified like Christ was and things like that. But you're right in general.
Right, and you point out that Duke is always the one who's saying Trump is no Jesus Christ, but they hate him just the same. And so it is interesting that becomes a focal point too of the Alex Jones background, is his interview with David Duke, where the sort of anti-Jewish right points out, look at David Duke. He exposed Alex Jones. Alex Jones was so antagonistic to the David Duke message. And so I think it's interesting that you then can begin to do some kind of analytical reading suspended between these two interviews that Alex Jones did. One with E. Michael Jones right in the heart of the Trump era, and then one with David Duke in the run-up to the Trump election, and sort of suspended these different camps on the right in relationship to their sort of patron intellectual saint. And there's Alex Jones as the fixed point of reference.
Interestingly, Jones did another interview, which was actually much friendlier than the David Duke interview with Louis Farrakhan.
Yes, right. And we dealt a little bit with the background there too, and I believe this is also Josh Reeves' work in terms of the background, the Scientology background. That's a key aspect. That's another piece of the missing background here. So we should delve back into that too. And remember, like right, you're talking about that interview that Alex Jones did with Louis Farrakhan in the run up to the Trump election. And it was very, very, very friendly.
Honestly, the one thing that brings all these people together, in addition to, I mean, you talk about the left, certainly in the case of E. Michael Jones and Alex Jones agreeing on that, is a common either love for and or defense of Trump is from these varying narratives. Like, you know, Farrakhan and Duke both saw Trump as a way, like as a slap in the face to Jewish power. And it's so interesting that is one of the things that continually brings all these people together. And every now and then an actual anti-Trump person might actually seep in. But as far as the strange bedfellows, it's very much, it seems to be either a love of Trump and or just a defense of Trump while putting at least out the veneer of serious opposition to Trump, which is how like the left Blumenthal, Jimmy Dore type of anti-Russiagate people do it. But there is this strange bedfellows. That is one of the things, is this constant.
And then one last common data point I just wanted to point out: if you were to do an analysis suspended between the Alex Jones interviews of David Duke to E. Michael Jones, is the question of the singular data point of September 11th. And go look at the background of E. Michael Jones. There's no serious analysis, it doesn't look like to me, of September 11th, the forensics of September 11th, who the parties were to all of that, and then that's always been the perpetual suspicion of David Duke by even people who might resonate with his anti-Jewish power critique, but they then point out, where is the question of September 11th? If if you're so invested in countering Jewish power, what about the role of the Jewish state in this touchstone event? And so then, of course, it's Alex Jones in the modern era, the retrenchment, the devolution of Alex Jones in relationship to the forensics and facts of the still most singularly important event of the 21st century.
And then you bring in, of course, Louis Farrakhan, who comes at it from ostensibly very different perspective than David Duke was. Louis Farrakhan has been, considered a 9/11 truther to the point to where he hosted, Kevin Barrett, who Alex Jones has never interviewed, and
Boleyn too. Yeah.
Yes, and Christopher Boleyn and Richard Gage. And by the way, when you mentioned Kevin Barrett's name on InfoWars when you called in after the 2016 election,
and Boleyn's, I also mentioned Boleyn and
Alex Jones particularly scoffed at Kevin Barrett's name when you mentioned him. Like, I'm not even going to get started on that first name you mentioned. And then so you think about that, and it's interesting the kind of people to get through there. And there's some things that need to be figured out there. And David Duke will play the 9/11 card based on who he's talking to, I think, a lot of the time. Like, he'll have people like Mark Dankoff on his radio show who will say flat out, Israel did 9/11 and architects and engineers for 9/11 truth and all this. But then at the same time, Duke himself has never actually said that. And he is he will pay lip service to that by saying, the Israelis, we have to look at them if we're looking at culprits. But at the same time, the idea of radical Muslims attacking us on September 11th fits into his narrative about things like the evils of mass immigration, for example, that only we had a responsible immigration system, something like this wouldn't have happened. So that's another dynamic there. So.
Yeah. And it does remind me too of Michael Maloof sort of sitting there while Kevin Barrett is interviewing him and professing based on certain easily ascertainable facts about September 11th. And Maloof doesn't sort of try to negate it, but he very quickly spins to 28 pages. Saudi Arabia, Islamic extremism has only been served, and so it sounds similar to me in the way that David Duke might approach someone like a Mark Dankoff, as you're talking about.
Very true. And so I guess with this, we're about ready to wrap up here.
Sounds good. Thank you for leading the way on this, Greg.
We went a couple of directions I wasn't initially intending to go into, but I think it actually worked out really well. And so bringing in the Blumenthals and the an actual, I think, an extension of the same strange Bedfellows conversation that we would have just had. We were just talking about the right, so to speak, but we brought in, the quote left with Max and Sidney Blumenthal, and I think it's even a more concise, in some ways, observation of the very strange Bedfellows that goes on. And I think that just what we talked about today, we have another number of interesting topics for the new year for 2020. So this is definitely going to be one hell of a fascinating year coming up, to say the least. So anyway, we'll God willing, we'll be here to analyze and document the events that go down.
Give thanks. Thank you, Greg.
Alrighty.